Welcome, friends. If Machias Seal Island is known at all, typically it's because of this guy, the Atlantic puffin, and kindred seabirds. Machias Seal Island is a great birdwatching location, and a very famous tour operator out of Jonesport, the Nortons, a father and son team, has taken all the famous naturalists plus lots of regular everyday tourists out to the island over the years. They're no longer operating the business, but their lobster boat was called the Chief, and painted on the stern was its home port, Machias Seal Island, USA. And if you took their tour, you'd get off on the island at this broken concrete ramp and be greeted by the Canadian lighthouse keepers who live on the island and are flown out on a rotating schedule, so the island is always staffed. And when I made the trip, the elder Norton grumbled kind of good-naturedly about the poor condition of the ramp, and the Canadian lighthouse keeper quipped in response, "Well, if it's his island, let him fix the ramp." And the reason all of this was an issue is because sovereignty over the island is still not resolved since the end of the U.S. War of Independence. Machias Seal Island isn't much of a place. It's about 20 acres, mostly bare rock, some scrub, some brush. There's a lighthouse maintained and staffed full-time by Canada. It's a breeding bird refuge with some blinds for visitors and a ramp where boaters can come ashore. And there's lobster harvesting in the adjacent waters. It lies at the southern end of the Grand Manan Channel that separates Maine from Grand Manan Island, in a broader area of rocks and shoals and shallows that projects southwesterly from the tip of Grand Manan Island. The island is just about equidistant from both Maine and Grand Manan Island, about 9 or 10 nautical miles from each, and it's a bit over 30 nautical miles from either the mainland of New Brunswick or the mainland of Nova Scotia. Those distances are important because the Treaty of Peace, ending the American Revolution, granted to the United States control over all islands within 20 leagues of the mainland of the new United States. A league is a bit of a shaky unit of measure, but generally refers to a distance of about 3 miles, sometimes statute miles, sometimes nautical miles, depending on the context. But think of it as about 3 miles. But there was an exception in the Treaty of Peace for any island that had previously been included in the land grant to William Alexander, the original proprietor of what became Nova Scotia. And his grant included all islands that were within about 6 leagues of the Canadian mainland. If we apply these rules literally, Machias Seal Island is within 20 leagues of the mainland of the United States, and it is not within 6 leagues of the lands that were granted to William Alexander that became Nova Scotia, so that it is not part of Nova Scotia, so therefore is part of the United States. But it's not that simple, sadly. Maritime boundaries, however, are generally not measured from the exact jagged coastline. The maritime boundary generally does not follow every zig and zag of a coastline, but they're drawn from a smoothed coastline on which the mouths of deep bays have been basically smoothed off with what's called a baseline. Now, this smoothing off is generally only applied to fairly deep bays. In fact, bays that are deep enough that the area of the bay is equal to half the area of a circle that has the width of the mouth of the bay as its diameter. So, following the idea of this generalized illustration of a bay here, this bay would just barely qualify to be smoothed off by a baseline. But a bay like the Bay of Fundy that's quite deep would automatically, instantly, easily qualify to be smoothed off by a baseline. Now, there are a bunch of challenges to applying this concept of a baseline to the actual geographic reality of the Bay of Fundy and Machias Seal Island. You can certainly draw a baseline from somewhere on the U.S.-Canada boundary, somewhere, say, not at all far from St. Andrews, in the place where Passamaquoddy Bay narrows down to a fairly small channel that separates the United States from Canada. And you can draw lines across to various points on the southern edge of Nova Scotia. And depending on where you land those lines in Nova Scotia, the distance from any of those baselines to Machias Seal Island turns out to be somewhere between about 5.8 and 6.2 leagues. So we're talking about differences of a couple of tenths of a league to a 17th century treaty that could not begin to measure at this level of precision. Then there are some other, perhaps even more difficult challenges. The first and the broadest is the concept of measuring to a baseline for determining international boundaries is basically a 20th century concept. That's when it sort of became codified in international diplomatic practice. So there's an open debate of whether it makes sense to apply a 20th century cartographic concept to a 17th century treaty handing over this parcel of North America to a colonial proprietor. And there's another problem. Drawing these baselines from somewhere on Nova Scotia to somewhere on the U.S.-American boundary, kind of up around St. Andrews, you have to remember that that boundary wasn't resolved finally until after the War of 1812, until comfortably into the 19th century. So for the people who made that land grant of Nova Scotia, that boundary between what we now call Maine and what we now call New Brunswick would have meant absolutely nothing to those people. So again, now we're applying a 19th century political boundary to draw a baseline in order to interpret a 17th century treaty. So there are problems both of, does it even make sense to have this conversation about baselines? And then, if we were to agree that it made sense to have these conversations, how in the world should those baselines be drawn? Now, it of course will come to no surprise to any of us that there are problems when old men sit around a conference table in Europe somewhere and try to draw lines about North America based on 18th century understandings of North American geography. Problems are bound to happen. And the problem of Machias Seal Island is, to my mind, the least bad of the boundary resolutions that were attempted by the treaty ending the War of the American Revolution. My absolute favorite example of a boundary problem considerably worse than that of Machias Seal Island is that of the northwest angle, a hunk of either Minnesota or Ontario, depending on how you look at it. Because Machias Seal Island, when you look at it, is really just a matter of vagueness. The original treaties are ambiguous, and it's not completely clear how they should be interpreted. In the case of the dispute that led to the creation of the Northwest Angle, the treaty writers accomplished something which actually was pretty hard to do. They wrote a boundary that was not just ambiguous, it was geographically and geometrically impossible. It simply could not exist at all. Because their boundaries suggested that the boundary between the United States and British Canada should run basically up the middle of Lake Superior to the mouth of the Pigeon River at Grand Portage, which was the principal canoe and fur trade route into the interior of northern Canada, and that the boundary should follow the normal fur trading route, which is a little vague, but it was generally understood to continue up the Pigeon River and then across a bunch of portages through various lakes and into Lake of the Woods. So it was vague, but it could possibly have been resolved by boundary commissioners and later surveys. They then called for that the boundary go to the northwest corner of Lake of the Woods. And there you begin to get into the impossible. Lakes generally are not rectangular. They don't have clear northwest corners, and Lake of the Woods doesn't either. There are a bunch of places that one could reasonably consider to be the northwest corner of Lake of the Woods. And then they pulled their spectacular move, and they said, from this northwest corner, the boundary should continue due west until it reaches the Mississippi River, and then follow the Mississippi River back south. Yeah, you get a picture of the problem, right? At no point at all does the Mississippi River go that far north. Now, when you think of 18th century geographic knowledge, if someone was standing at what is now Minneapolis and looking at this great, huge river that comes pouring down out of the north, you'd think, yeah, obviously, this river comes from somewhere way up north. And it probably goes, all the way into what we now understand to be Ontario, and it probably does go somewhere west of Lake of the Woods. But of course it doesn't. As you go north from Minneapolis, the Mississippi River basically takes a great big sweeping left turn and never gets anywhere even close to being as far north as what we now know to be the Canadian border. So they wrote a treaty that was absolutely impossible. You can travel west from the northwest corner of Lake of the Woods as far as you want, and all you will do is go around and around and around the world over and over again, and you will never, ever hit the Mississippi River. That's why later the resolution created this wildly convoluted process that ended at something that could have been considered the northwest corner of Lake of the Woods, and they drew a line due south to the 49th parallel, which then became the boundary that separated Western Canada from the Western United States. And the problem in doing that is that it sliced off a hunk of Ontario surrounded by water on 3 sides and the rest of Ontario on the 4th side. And that hunk of land, completely and totally disconnected from the United States, became inside this boundary line. So if you think Machias Seal Island is a mess, the northwest angle is way, way, way more of a mess. So, if the treaty itself is not going to get us out of this problem, how are we going to come up with some sort of resolution to sovereignty over, or control over, or title to Machias Seal Island? And there's kind of a hierarchy of rules in the international relations world, and it goes generally like this. First, if there is a treaty, you do what the treaty says. And anything that follows the treaty is more or less irrelevant. So if one nation ceded a claim to a particular body of land to another nation, that claim remains done, remains ceded. Now, if there isn't a good treaty, if there isn't clear, useful treaty language, then kind of the next set of rules you use is the question of who genuinely exercises sovereignty over this disputed area? Who really and truly governs it? And then if there's some question about who really and truly governs it, you can fall back to kind of a third set of criteria. You can ask the question, is this area in dispute somehow geologically contiguous with either of the nations that have a claim on it? Or does it have long-standing cultural or economic ties to either of those nations? There's sort of a famous definition of sovereignty popular among the international relations folks, that it is the exclusive authority to act coercively over a population. And those are kind of magical words. This notion of exclusive authority, the final and ultimate authority, recognizing that there are lots of authorities that operate in the world. And that a sovereign doesn't have to be coercive all the time, but has to have the power to be coercive, to do things that the population doesn't want. I would only correct that definition by suggesting that sovereignty is an authority to act coercively in a place rather than over a population. Because sovereignty fundamentally is tied to locations, tied to places. And if you move from the jurisdiction of one sovereign to another, you escape that sovereign's ability to be coercive over you. Now, international law is kind of tricky on claims of sovereignty. First off, a claim of sovereignty has got to be based on real, actual sovereignty, not some theatrical display of made-up sovereignty. So Canada has a claim here on this island. Part of what Canada does, clearly, is theater. Staffing a lighthouse in an era of fully automated lighthouses is kind of international relations theater. Putting the lighthouse keepers in a Grand Manan electoral district rather than letting them vote in their home districts. That's theater. Now, lighthouses are tricky as well because they occupy kind of a special place in international law. Simply putting up aids to navigation is well understood to not be sufficient to establish a claim of sovereignty. But what Canada has done is considerably more than that. Over the time that they've controlled this island, I believe they've built 5 lighthouses. An original pair, that pair rebuilt again for a total of 4, and then the current lighthouse for the 5th. So that's real. Canada maintains a bird refuge. It's not a lot of work, but it's the business of governing. They maintain the access. The boat ramp may be rough, people may complain about it, but somebody builds it and maintains it, and that's Canada. And they even exert a little bit of coercion in the sense of fisheries management and then managing access rules for the refuge. So there's not a lot of government displayed on Machias Seal Island, but it's a little speck of rock. It doesn't need a lot of government. And what government that actually does get displayed and functions is the Canadian government. A claim for sovereignty can also be built on the argument that an island is somehow geologically contiguous with some adjoining mainland. But that's a tricky idea too. If we use undersea topography as a proxy for geology, Machias Seal Island certainly seems contiguous with Grand Manan, but both the island and Grand Manan seem contiguous with the U.S. mainland. And in part because of situations like this, international courts have been skeptical of arguments based on topography as a proxy for geology, because it often doesn't reliably reflect the underlying geology. Geologically, Machias Seal Island is mostly granite, Grand Manan is mostly basalt, but that in fact proves rather little because most of the mainland of eastern Maine and southern New Brunswick is nothing but bands of basalt and granite. Basically, the geology of the entire area is contiguous, so really can't be used to pin down an idea that Machias Seal Island geologically belongs to one country or the other. The situation in the Grand Manan Channel started to get a little more complicated in the 1970s, when the United Nations ratified the Third Convention on the Law of the Sea. Among other things, the convention clarified the amount of authority coastal states could exercise in different bands from their coasts, and established and made uniform this whole notion of a 200-mile exclusive economic zone where states could exert pretty much total control over harvesting of both minerals and creatures of the sea. The convention also codified the idea of internal waters, including these deep bays and around island chains where states could limit access as well as economic activity. And that was actually the criterion around which the dispute over the Passamaquoddy liquefied natural gas terminal of a decade or so ago was debated. Canada claimed that the waters between Deer Island and Campobello Island, which a liquefied natural gas tanker would have to travel en route to the proposed natural gas terminal, were part of their internal waters because they passed through an archipelago of Canadian islands. Therefore, Canada argued they could prohibit or severely restrict the passage of LNG tankers headed toward that natural gas terminal. And the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, of course, created its own problems, particularly for neighboring countries for whom these 200-mile buffers overlapped. And that was the case for the United States and Canada in the Gulf of Maine. 200 miles from either the United States or Canada would, of course, include just about all the Gulf of Maine, including the fishing grounds on Browns Bank off Nova Scotia and Georges Bank off Massachusetts. These are shallow areas of the Gulf that are particularly fertile and valuable for fishing. The United States suggested the logical way to split up the Gulf of Maine was to draw a border down the so-called Thalweg, the deepest channel that kind of flows from Passamaquoddy Bay out to the open ocean. Canada suggested the logical division would be to draw a line that's more or less equidistant from each nation's mainland. And the big issue when this happened was who got to fish on Georges Bank. Canada's line would give about a quarter of the bank to Canada. The U.S. line, the U.S. proposal would give Canada none of Georges Bank. And the two nations decided to let international courts adjudicate these completing claims. Curiously, both nations, though, agreed to have the adjudication begin at a point south and west of Machias Seal Island, so explicitly left Machias Seal Island out of the area to be adjudicated by the international courts. 200 miles from either the United States or Canada would, of course, include just about all the Gulf of Maine, including the fishing grounds on Browns Bank off Nova Scotia and Georges Bank off Massachusetts. These are shallow areas of the Gulf that are particularly fertile and valuable for fishing. The United States suggested the logical way to split up the Gulf of Maine was to draw a border down the so-called Thalweg, the deepest channel that kind of flows from Passamaquoddy Bay out to the open ocean. Canada suggested the logical division would be to draw a line that's more or less equidistant from each nation's mainland. And the big issue when this happened was who got to fish on Georges Bank. Canada's line would give about a quarter of the bank to Canada. The U.S. line, the U.S. proposal would give Canada none of Georges Bank. And the two nations decided to let international courts adjudicate these completing claims. Curiously, both nations, though, agreed to have the adjudication begin at a point south and west of Machias Seal Island, so explicitly left Machias Seal Island out of the area to be adjudicated by the international courts. And here is the actual map issued by the international courts in rendering this judgment. And I apologize for the poor quality of the map. I'm trying to be faithful to the actual true source document. I just added a couple of annotations to hopefully make it a little bit clearer. And basically what happened was the court ruled that Canada should get some of the tip of Georges Bank, but not as much as Canada would have hoped for, but not as little as the United States proposed. For us, however, the interesting question is why the parties did not resolve the issue of Machias Seal Island as long as they were going to all the trouble of submitting this entire case for international court resolution. We can only speculate. So that's the factual situation. Now it might be interesting to speculate a little bit on the motivations involved, and specifically why the parties didn't take advantage of the opportunity to resolve the question of Machias Seal Island and its neighboring waters, as long as they were going to all the trouble of submitting the entire rest of the Gulf of Maine to international adjudication. And this is purely speculative from here on out. We're going beyond the actual data. But I see 4 kind of broad themes that we might consider. And if we rank them from kind of the most cynical to the most noble, they go kind of like this. First, we have to consider the possibility that there are simply strategic or commercial interests that are not publicized and of which we are not aware. The geology of the area is not really prone to petroleum, but there is an interesting tectonic history in the area that has created some metals and minerals deposits in nearby Washington County, so it's not out of the question that there would be geological resources of some sort that might be valuable. There are also some odd sort of strategic and military things in the area. As you know, eastern Maine absolutely bristles with military communications facilities and these immense military antenna arrays. So there's no evidence that there's anything strategically significant about the waters off Washington County, but it's not completely out of the question. Now, getting a little more into the realm of the likely, Canadian cartographers cited an unnamed Canadian diplomat explaining that both the United States and Canada, when they submitted the dispute over the Gulf of Maine for adjudication, what they really wanted was to get as much of Georgia's bank as possible. And what both parties really wanted to avoid was giving the International Court an opportunity to give more of Georgia's bank to the other party, and then feel they could give the losing party in the Georgia's bank dispute something kind of in the spirit of a consolation prize by giving them Machias Seal Island. So to say to Canada, no, I'm sorry, we reject your claims on Georgia's bank, but you can have Machias Seal Island. See, we're being fair. And the same thing could have been done to the United States. So I have no idea that that necessarily is what motivated the two countries to avoid having Machias Seal Island resolved by the International Court, but there's at least a little glimmer of evidence that that might have been involved. And third, there's the problem that for elected officials, it's one thing to lose some fishing rights to some unseen underwater bank. It's quite another to allow an international court to take away actual land, even if that land is 20 acres of rocks that nobody particularly wants. You can just imagine the politicians, at least in my country, I won't speak for Canada, yelling and screaming and banging the table about these pointy-headed bureaucrats in Europe who have stolen our land or something like that. So the risk of losing Machias Seal Island might have been rhetorically so costly, that few elected officials were willing to take the risk. And the fourth, and the one possible explanation that I think is kind of the most noble, is that it's just not worth worrying about. That not every little speck of land has got to have a known sovereign. That it's just perfectly fine if a 20-acre rocky island and its surrounding waters remain unresolved in terms of who controls them. It hasn't really been a problem for the last couple of 100 years. It's a fairly minor and manageable problem in terms of whose lobster fishing regulations apply where. But it's just not a big deal. That in fact sovereignty, that we yell and scream about so much, maybe just isn't all that big a deal. Well, thank you very much for your interest. If we were all together in a Zoom session, I would invite questions at this point. Since we're not, let me invite you, if anyone wants to sort of kick any of these ideas around, please drop me an email. Best place to reach me is dmcdermott, that's McDermott, at CSC, that's Chadron State College, csc.edu. dmcdermott at csc.edu. Thank you very much.